talk in some sense is a stock take of India's climate policy, the experience so far, and what we expect at a little bit of what we expect at the COP, and what we expect India's climate policy to be in the future. So this talk is given by me and my colleague, Dr. Shravanti Choragudi, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the Demetra Center. She has a PhD in economics from the Center for Development Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. So let me first give a brief introduction to the topic of today's talk, and then we will move on to Shravanti's talk. There. Is this? Can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Hello, is my screen being shared?
No.
No. Oops.
The box with the
share content. No, this is share content. Okay. Now I hope I can share my screen.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So. Yeah. So today's talk will be essentially in two parts. Let me give you a short introduction of what we intend to talk about, and then I'll hand over to Shravanti to talk about climate policy so far, and then I will look at climate policy going ahead. So we are at an interesting time when it comes to climate change. So as we all know, India is going to be one of the worst affected countries when it comes to climate change, and we are already seeing its impacts every day, pretty much. And that's one reason why India has been very active in international climate change diplomacy, as well as in crafting climate change policies, both at home and helping craft these abroad. India has played a key role in the UNFCCC negotiations right from the very beginning at Rio, and has helped form the treaties at Kyoto, and then in latest in Paris in 2015. And it has been a strong voice in favor of all developing countries, as well as in favor of equity in climate change action, as encapsulated by the famous common but differentiated responsibilities phrase. And India has in the last few years also achieved a lot of success in climate change mitigation, and it has crafted very good policies. It has moved on quite rapidly in renewable energy, as well as in electric vehicles and a whole range of other policies. And it's actually one of the few major economies that has successfully changed its emission trajectory and is on path to meet a 2-degree target, though we of course would like to aim for better than that. So, and my talk, which follows this, will actually be on today's net zero, the global net zero approach, and how India should respond to it, as well as what sort of strategies we need in the next 10 to 15 years to deepen our climate change policies, as well as to prepare for challenges ahead. So with that, I will hand over to Shravanti. What happened? Okay.
Thank you, Shoibal. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. India's climate policy had been and continues to be determined by its evolving stance on the degree of responsibility for global climate change and the actions it has been taking to mitigate the climate change on one hand, and at the same time it also depends upon the way the state is interweaving climate actions with its growth and development objectives. So the aim of this talk is to walk you through India's climate policy and the progress it has achieved in climate action. Now, here is the structure of the presentation. First, we shall talk about the ecosystem that had been facilitated for India's climate action. We shall discuss the developments that occurred both at the international context as well as the domestic front. Secondly, we will talk about few key sectors that had been identified to tackle climate change goals. And we will talk about noted policies in each of these sectors and the progress we have achieved so far. Finally, I would like to draw attention to few aspects pertaining to India's climate policy and governing structures in the hope to share as well as gather insights to strengthen India's climate governance system. Now, India's climate policy is a reflection and subset of its foreign policy, diplomatic relations, and power struggles at the geopolitical arena. Historically, it has been a very vocal and a persistent proponent of climate justice, and as Shoibal said, it stressed on common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Now, as a large developing economy, we do have emitting increasingly larger amounts of emissions. Along with, at the same time, we do have unmet growth and development needs like poverty, other welfare concerns like inequality. Now, so due to this, India faces a very unique position to act on its emissions. At the same time, we do have to demand for our carbon space. Now, to demonstrate its commitment to the climate change goals, India did submit National Action Plan for Climate Change to UNFCCC in 2008 and renewed its commitment through intended nationally determined contributions in 2015. Now, due to its commitment, proactive role in international negotiations and progress it achieved, India transitioned from being a difficult partner to an alternative power. Now, while the change that is brought in the dynamics or the power struggles at the international forum prepared India ground to act on the climate change, different factors led to design a climate policy at the domestic front. Now, a better comprehension of climate science, now a better understanding of climate change-led vulnerability, and at the same time, the potential to align climate action with our growth and development needs, that is to achieve co-benefits. These are the different factors that helped us design our climate policy. National Action Plan of Climate Change in 2008 marked India's national climate policy making. Under this action plan, 8 missions have been identified which have bearing on climate change. They range from water, energy, forest, habitat, and others. Now, nearly a decade later, India's climate action has been renewed through INDCs at Paris. These are the 3 quantifiable goals: to increase non-fossil electricity generation capacity to 40% by 2030, to reduce the carbon intensity of the economy by 33 to 35% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels, and to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Now, in the past 2 decades, the state put together extensive governance system to meet the goals set at NAPCC as well as INDC. Variety of ministries, departmental units, state governments are roped in. And state's proactive role, in fact, created an ecosystem which attracted private agents who became a part of India's climate action. They're involved in financing, innovating, manufacturing, installing, generating, and in general, they viewed climate action as an opportunity for economic growth and development. Indeed, India did achieve impressive progress and our carbon emission intensity has exhibited a steady decline, and we had been in the past few years, the reduction has been at 21%. Now, in the discussion that follows, we shall dwell on 4 key sectors. Now, we will be talking about power sector with the stress on renewable energy, energy efficiency with a focus on industry, forestry, and finally knowledge generation. Of course, it is needless to say that these are not the only 4 key sectors that have bearing on climate change, but for the present talk, we'll be dealing only with the 4 of these. And also these 4 sectors have subsectors and components with varying degrees of success and difficulties. But in general, we will be talking at the very basic level, and anybody in the audience want to pitch in about the details, we can do it at the discussion. Now, first, let's move on to the power sector. Of all the sectors that had been identified to tackle our climate goals, power sector is the one which received the highest focus, attention at the international arena, at the policy level, domestic policy level, market, finance, and in fact, we initiated the renewable energy goals at a very humble way of just trying to achieve 20 gigawatt of solar energy capacity by 2020, but obviously we outdid ourselves and we upgraded our goals. In 2015, we announced 175 gigawatt target. And by April 2021, we reached a capacity of 95 gigawatt, and that is accounting for 38.5% of total electricity generation capacity. And solar and wind obviously are the ones which had been growing at a very rapid rate. Now, this impressive outcome of renewable energy was possible because of equally impressive policy boost that had been extended to this sector. May it be fiscal instruments, may it be trade, removal of trade barriers, encouraging and giving financial aid for installing, generating, selling, and purchasing of renewable energy. In 2019, given the way which we are rapidly growing with respect to this sector, we again upgraded our target to 450 gigawatt by 2030. Obviously, this sector is not without problems, and one of the issues that we face in this is our lack of strong manufacturing base, and we largely depend upon imports in this sector for our, obviously, the components and any other hardware. Let's move on to the next one, that is energy efficiency. Over years, several steps have been taken to reduce the energy efficiency of our economy. In the figure on your left, you can see the energy intensity has been steadily falling. That is the energy units per every unit of GDP. But the one sector which had been receiving focus is with respect to enhancing our energy efficiency is industry, because 45% of our commercial energy is consumed by this industry. Now, here I would like to highlight 2 notable policy instruments. One is Perform, Achieve, Trade, and second one is Market Transformation for Energy Efficiency. Perform, Achieve, Trade is basically a market-based compliance mechanism where energy intensive sectors like paper and pulp, iron and steel, fertilizer, cement, the units from these industries are notified to reduce their energy consumption, and these savings are in turn converted into tradable instruments. So the units which are performing and units which are not able to meet these have to purchase or sell the instruments in the market. Now, so far 4 such Perform, Achieve, Trade cycles have been implemented, and the results are impressive. And in the figure on your right, you can see in each of these sectors what is the energy savings that had been achieved. The second one that is worth mentioning is Market Transformation of Energy Efficiency. Here the government is trying to accelerate the shift in the usage and manufacturing and usage of energy efficient appliances. In this program, the government roped in financial institutions to facilitate and encourage innovation, sale, manufacturing, and use, where the state is acting as a cushion for risk in this new technologies that could work or not, but still it's going to provide a cushion so that it will encourage both the manufacturers and the users to go for this energy efficient appliances. These are for both domestic and industrial sector. Now let's move on to the next one, that is the forestry sector. Now India is one of the few countries that have exhibited a steady increase in our forest and tree cover. It has increased 1.3 million hectares between 2015 and 2019, and the carbon sequestered by this forest and tree cover has been steadily increasing. Between 2000 and 2016, it is around 40%. Now, however, despite this impressive achievement, this is one sector in which we might be falling way short in meeting our goals. If you remember, one of the INDC goals are to create a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion 3 billion tons of CO2. For that, we need extra 30 million hectares of additional forest land. So far we have 75, presently we have 75 million hectares of tree forest and tree cover, but the state is a little unclear about where are we going to get the 30 million hectares of additional forest land. And the other thing that experts show concern about is that about when we talk about forest and tree cover, we are primarily talking about the quantity or just the tree count, but little attention is being paid into the details which entail to create the right ecological conditions that like moisture in the soil, or the conditions that promote biodiversity, or the conditions that prevent soil erosion, or these are the details that had been missing when we are talking about increasing the forest cover. And they say that attention to the just not the count, but it is the quality and the nature of the forest cover does matter. Now lastly, we'll be talking about knowledge generation. The importance of knowledge generation dissemination in the field of climate change it cannot be overemphasized. It involves studies of measurements and quantification of various elements that have an implication of understanding climate change, and dynamic nature of technology and knowledge itself, and finally converting new technologies and emerging technologies into profitable opportunities. Therefore, knowledge generation and dissemination has been identified as one of the 8 missions during our National Action Plan. The objective is not only to generate it, but disseminate it to allow for efficient technology and policy interface. At the same time, the state expects inputs from this mission so that it can use it during its negotiations in the international forum. Different variety of educational institutions, universities, science and technology labs have been roped in, networks have been created, collaborative work has been promoted, R&D programs have been funded. And the Vecha Center is one of the 11 centers of excellence identified under this mission. So far we discussed the progress in few key sectors, but there are few aspects in India's climate governance that needs attention. This few aspects that I'm going to discuss now have the bearing both at academic and the policy domain. First one is loosely built governing structures. Now, governing structures that presently exist in India's climate to tackle India's climate goals, however impressive they seem to be, they are primarily layered on the existing bureaucratic system. Existing ministries and departments are assigned climate goals as their additional responsibilities which are already having their own objectives to deal with. Now, in certain cases, the outcomes of these schemes and programs that are already function are picked up, exposed, and we are trying to figure out if and how they are going to meet our climate goals. We need to have dedicated bodies, dedicated organizations to plan, implement, and oversee our climate actions. And further, these bodies or these organizations need to be insulated against political and economic vagaries. Then a second part is goal orientation versus wish-like approach. Now, in this presentation, in our discussion, majority of the time we discussed about the sectors or areas where the goals had been set, goals had been already laid down very clearly, but that's not the case with all the sectors or all the areas that had been identified under climate action. For example, National Mission on Sustainable Habitat, National Mission for Agriculture Activities, Sustainable Agriculture. In these missions, the specific goals had not been identified. When specific goals are not identified, the policy attention they receive is also limited. This eventually means that it is going to attract much less attention from the private actors in terms of investment, innovation, manufacturing, and basically it has much less chance of being found as a potential area to be invested in. So unless the state is present in these sectors in a very dominant way, as we have seen in renewable energy, nothing much is going to happen if it is not given equal priority. Now, lastly, immediate implications to growth with long timelines in distant future. So it is evident that the sectors that seem to have immediate economic growth implications, they have received abundant of policy attention. Now, like forest or agriculture or sustainable habitat, these are the sectors where the results are not immediate. They are far in the timelines are far into the future. So it is, I think that we need to revise how we approach climate change, not just from the perspective of few sectors, but wider economy. Now, climate action ought to transform from perception of economic objectives to development processes. Thereby, we can trench faster and deeper pathways to low carbon future. So this is what I have to say, and thank you for listening. And I would like to thank Professor Somnathan of ISI Delhi and Shoibal. The insights for this talk and the paper on which it is based on comes from my discussions with them. And I would also like to thank our administrative staff to making this happen. Thank you.
So now we will carry on with the second part of this talk, which is here. Okay. Stop sharing. Okay. Share content. No, that's fine. Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible. Yeah.
This is visible? Okay. So I'm going to start my part of the talk, which is about India's climate policy going forward. I will look at three aspects primarily. The first is the politics of climate policy making. in which the Indian, this is the politics of international climate policy making, in which the Indian policy making is plugged in, and how we are currently approaching the politics of international climate policy making. Then I will look at what India can do in the short-term future in terms of climate policies that build on our past successes and that are the right way forward, irrespective of what the international policy making environment is. And then I'll show that given the successes that we have, we can actually aim higher and come up with more ambitious policies, which, while we advocate in the international arena for more equity in international climate policy making. So this is a brief overview of what I actually mentioned at the very beginning in the introduction, that India is definitely in favor of limiting dangerous climate change, and that is in some sense translated into a goal of limiting equilibrium warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, a past IPCC report on 1.5 degrees shows that is equivalent to having a goal of limiting carbon dioxide emissions, bringing them down to zero by the second half, by 2050, which is just a few decades from now. Now, in the last few years, this global net zero emissions goal has in some sense been translated by various actors, both multilateral as well as countries, into individual net zero goals. As in that every country in some sense has its own individual goal to reach net zero emissions by 2050 or 60 or 70. And India's position has been that this translation of a global net zero goal into a individual country level net zero goal is very insincere, and it is very unfair to developing countries. Now, of course, all of this requires deep decarbonization of the global economy, both the energy as well as the industrial sector. And it also requires having a financial regime which supports developing countries to progress in this direction while they also manage their own development. So none of these have actually in some sense been addressed yet, and these are open problems for the future. At the same time, what we find is that India has achieved significant success in some of its climate mitigation policies, and it can build on these and achieve much more in the next 10 to 15 years while we hash out what the global climate regime should be. So if you look at the goals of this COP26, they are primarily four: secure a global net zero commitment by mid-century, and also to mobilize finance. The goal was to mobilize about $100 billion of international climate finance by year 2020, and we are nowhere close to that yet. The other two goals, which are to adapt to protect communities, essentially a goal of adaptation and resilience towards climate change, as well as to work together as a community to deliver on our goals. So what we find is that there are goals that are aspirational and the goals that are quantitative, and I'll focus primarily in the rest of the talk on the first quantitative goal and what it means to India and the world. So the whole phrase global net zero ideal actually came from the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So what the eventual result of a large number of studies is that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we have to turn around the global emissions, CO2 emissions, and limit them to approximately 500 to 600 billion tons of CO2 beginning today and reach net zero or reach zero emissions in approximately 2050 to 2060. How do I go back? Page. So this is where the global net zero goal appears, and so now this confusion of global net zero with country level net zero goals is a matter of great concern, at least from the climate diplomacy point of view. This is very much so once you realize that the total cumulative emissions headroom that is available for the world, if really want to take this goal seriously, is approximately 500 billion tons. And the world is right now emitting approximately 35 billion tons, which means that you're going to reach this goal in about 10 to 15 years, sometime around 2020, 2030 to 35. One will actually exhaust the global cumulative emissions goal. Which means that if developing countries have to grow, then at least the developed world has to do significantly more than reach zero emissions by 2050. And so this is the conundrum that the developed and the developing world have to hash out. And while we attempt to solve these issues, we have to still go ahead with what India can do in terms of policies that are beneficial to its own development goals, at the same time are the appropriate policies for climate. So if you look at India's approach to climate policy making, as Shravanti has already spoken about these, they are primarily in the form of goals being set at the national level, and which then percolate down the federal structure of India. And these goals have so far been achieved in a somewhat ad hoc and opportunistic way. This is by which I mean that we have not set up a separate bureaucratic apparatus to deal with climate change. It has been layered on top of the entire bureaucratic apparatus that already exists. And these policies are of various flavors. One set of policies consists of having targets and specific policy support and the creation of new market mechanisms to achieve these goals. For example, this has been the case in terms of LEDs, solar PV, and recently in electric vehicles. A second set of approach has been about having new regulations, new regulatory standards that over time improve energy efficiency or emissions efficiency. This is where the Bureau of Energy Efficiency's appliance star ratings and vehicle fuel efficiency standards appear. Finally, we also have targeted fiscal policies, as in targeted budgetary support for specific technologies that help in either research and development or deployment of these technologies. And this has again been in the case of initially with electricity from wind, and then followed by solar PV. And this has also been in the case of expanding and extending the transmission network. So we will, and these by and large have been fairly successful, at least in those areas where they have been focused on and have been applied. And we will see many more of, I guess, these approaches in the coming future. So if you look at the electricity sector, India has already almost achieved this 40% non-fossil energy capacity that it had promised for 2030. At the same time, we have actually enhanced these goals and hope that we will take this forward to about 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. Now, if we actually achieve these goals in the next 10 years, then the share of non-fossil generation in India is likely to reach anywhere between 55 to 65% by 2030. And the share of generation, as in energy generated from non-fossil capacity, is going to reach approximately 40%. Today, it is around 20%. So this transformation is almost completely a result of the National Solar Mission and other allied policies, where we combine various approaches to climate policy making, targeted sectoral policies, new market mechanisms like the reverse auction discovery process. And these are also, of course, we have also benefited from the global reduction in price of these technologies, and primarily driven by technological improvement and expansion of capacity of manufacturing capacity in the rest of the world. And I believe right now India will also take a much bigger role in manufacturing of solar PVs, batteries, and so on. So when one looks at the cost of these various technologies, then you realize that in some sense not much support is actually required right now, because wind, solar PV, and a large number of renewable technologies are actually cheaper than new fossil fuel technologies. So this is based on projecting costs and technological improvement into the middle of this decade. And what we find is that when one looks at the levelized cost of electricity, which also takes into account the social cost, for example, cost of balancing energy, or cost of balancing renewable intermittency, or the cost of pollution, then what we find is that renewables with storage are roughly comparable to a new coal plant at the mine, and often significantly cheaper than new coal plants which are at a distance from the mine, where you also have to account for the cost of transportation. In fact, if the situation is such that currently approximately half of India's coal has a running cost that is higher than the cost of new renewables in the country. So the next thing that I want to focus on is carbon taxes. Now, I think most of you would find it surprising that we have carbon taxes in India. The thing is that we have taxes which are often implicit. So the only direct carbon tax that one could actually account for is the clean energy cess on coal, which is right now called the GST compensation cess, which is approximately $400 rupees per ton of coal. This is equivalent to about $3 to $4 per ton of carbon dioxide emissions from the coal. Now, this is a direct tax on coal, but if you also account for the fact that renewable energy pays no interstate transmission cost, or that rail freight actually cross-subsidizes passenger traffic, and actually coal pays a slightly higher freight than some of the other goods, then what we find is that the effective carbon tax, where we include both implicit and explicit carbon tax, is often higher for coal. And it is significantly higher for those coal plants that are at a distance from the mines. It's one reason why, for example, in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, renewable energy has been cheaper than coal for quite a few years now. And that's the reason why you have much more renewable in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, as well as Rajasthan. Next, if you look at taxes on diesel and petrol in India, if you excise plus value-added tax or sales tax at the state level, then the tax is equivalent to a carbon tax of approximately $200 to $300 per ton of carbon dioxide, which is a fairly high tax. Now, in the US, for example, the social cost of carbon that the current administration would want to apply is about $50 per ton, and the OECD has has modeled and calculated that approximately 120 euros per ton would be what is required for decarbonization by 2050. So if you compare to that, then some of our implicit taxes are actually higher than these taxes. And these are already having an effect. Renewables is already cheaper than coal in many parts of the country. And we also find that two-wheelers and three-wheelers, electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers are increasing at a very rapid rate right now. So this is a plot from 2018, which shows the effective carbon tax for different sectors of the economy. So transportation actually has the highest carbon tax, but if one looks at the tax on coal and how it affects industry, then electricity generation and industry also have a nominal carbon tax of approximately $3 to $4 per ton. Transportation and agriculture, which uses diesel in the form of fuel for irrigation pumps, actually face the highest tax. And currently these taxes are significantly higher. So here we find that about 11 to 12% of India's carbon dioxide emissions face a tax that is higher than 60 euros per ton. But this was in 2018, and currently it is higher than almost 200 euros per ton. So these taxes actually have already been transforming the Indian energy use in the last few years. Next, we look at specific targeted policies for electric vehicles. So we have what's called FAME, or Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid and Electric Vehicles. Primarily it offers a cost subsidy or a discount while purchase of new vehicles. And it also helps manufacturers set up capacity by providing them production or manufacturing incentives. The third part of this policy is to help establish a charging network. What we find is that, again, given the high taxes on fuel, that electric three-wheelers or autos are already more economical than petrol and LPG autos. I'm sure you must have noticed that that in the last few months there have been a rapid increase in the number of electric three-wheelers on Bangalore streets. It's the same with electric two-wheelers as well. Once the initial cost discount is taken into cost subsidy, the purchase subsidy is taken into account, electric two-wheelers are already significantly cheaper when it comes to total cost of running compared to internal combustion engines. So, and this policies therefore is going to make a big difference to India's vehicular manufacturing in the next 10 years. 70% of India's registered vehicles are actually two-wheelers, and two-wheelers are responsible for approximately 60% of all the petrol that is consumed in transportation. So the FAME policy is likely to lead to approximately 30% share of electric vehicles by the end of the decade, by which time India's two-wheeler manufacturing will also rise by a factor of 2. So one simple thing that can actually be done is to mandate 100% electrification of two-wheelers by 2030. It's very likely that this might anyway happen given the rapid pace at which the market is changing currently, so that even in the absence of a policy, most of the two-wheelers being sold in India by 2030 will likely be electric. For bigger vehicles, we need more targeted policies, given that the advantage of electrification is not yet significant, given that these require very large batteries, and which is where most of the cost disadvantage currently is. Another very important segment that we are currently transforming is railways. So railways, we are likely to have electrification of railways by 2024. At the same time, moving a significant part of our commodity and commodity and freight transportation back to railways would lead to very high increase in efficiency and of transportation, and it will also, as the electricity generating network becomes more and more green, as it becomes more renewables, it will also lead to significant reduction in emissions from transportation. Studies show that approximately 10 gigatons of CO2 in emissions can be saved in the next 20-30 years if and when we complete this transformation. Again, this is something that Shravanti has already spoken about, which is energy use efficiency. A significant number of policies have already been implemented in India, which have led to increase in the efficiency of appliances, and we have already saved many million tons of CO2 emissions by just increasing the efficiency of almost all household appliances, and especially air conditioners and refrigerators. India has also practically completely transformed its lighting industry, and now it only uses LEDs and CFLs. So the biggest growth in India's household energy emissions is very likely to come from air conditioning, and the improvements in efficiency standards of air conditioning can potentially save something like 100 million tons of CO2 in the next by 2027, and it's very likely that this will save significantly more in the next few decades as India becomes richer and air conditioning becomes more and more affordable for people. The industrial sector, which is responsible for a quarter of India's emissions, is actually the biggest challenge. It's because India is still a growing country and the industrial sector is likely to expand quite fast. And when we look at the core sectors, cement, steel, fertilizer, and chemicals, which contribute to 80% of India's emissions, these are also the most difficult to decarbonize. So we have had some progress in increasing efficiency in these sectors. And there have also been it's also possible to increase efficiency significantly further by actually having a policy that includes the cost of pollution from coal in the cost of coal. Now, if that is done, as some of my research has shown, that actually adds approximately $20 to $30 per ton to the cost of coal, which almost doubles the cost of coal in the country. For example, if we add the cost of pollution to electricity generated from coal in India, that will add approximately 2 rupees per kilowatt hour to the cost of electricity from coal. For long-term deep decarbonization, we actually need newer technologies, and one of the most important ones is to actually use electricity to generate hydrogen and then use the hydrogen as an industrial feed. And this is where our National Hydrogen Mission which has just been launched, will possibly take us further in the next few decades. So, given all these sectoral policies and targets that we have, I think India can aim significantly higher compared to the NDCs that it already has. So, if you remember our nationally determined contributions for 2015 Paris Agreement, the first one is 40% non-fossil share in electricity generation. I believe we will achieve that in the next year itself. A second one is the 24% is a 30 to 35% reduction in emissions intensity, or emissions per rupee of GDP compared to the 2005 baseline. We have already achieved approximately 24-25% by 2016. So given the achievement that we have already had, and given the policies that we have, and the technologies that we have access to and can use to make India's energy more emissions efficient, I think we can go for significantly ambitious targets. I believe it would be possible to reach 55 to 65% non-fossil share of electricity generation by 2030, and That translates to about 40% of electricity generation from non-fossil sources in 2030. Our emissions intensity could possibly go down by about 40% compared to 2005 baseline. And given what we have seen about the comparative cost of coal with renewables and storage, I believe it might also be possible for India to say that we will not have any more new coal plants by 2030. In fact, it could be possible even earlier. So these are the possible significantly more ambitious NDC targets that India could consider, especially in this COP, or at least going forward in the next few years. So what I would conclude is that India's somewhat opportunistic and somewhat ad hoc climate policy making, which puts development at the center of the climate policy, while at the same time making use of policy making that actually emphasizes the co-benefits of climate policy instead of the climate policy as such. By co-benefits, I refer to increase in manufacturing or pollution benefits and so on. So this sort of an approach to climate policy making has actually been very successful and is very likely to continue at least in this decade and maybe further down. And given the success we have had, I think India can propose more ambitious nationally determined contributions in the next round of commitments, very likely in this COP as well. And while we achieve these goals in climate mitigation, India should continue to focus, at least in the international negotiations, on equity and climate finance, and provide the same leadership role to other developing countries, and make sure that policy making in the international arena is fair and equitable to the needs of development, while at the same time targeting dangerous climate change. Thank you very much.
You hear me?
Yes, Professor Srinivasan.
For a very echo here. Hello?
Hello, yes.
There's an echo here. Can it be stopped?
Wait, let me switch off my mic.
Hello? Yeah.
Now it is better, sir.
Yeah, now it's better. Thank you. So let me first thank Shravanti and Shoaib for a very lucid presentation of what India has done so far and what we can do going forward. Let me add a few other issues before we open up this talk for discussion. Now, it was pointed out that India was a leader in the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. And that's true. But all of us must agree that the Paris Agreement was essentially a failure, because the Paris Agreement essentially did not give much of a weightage to common but differentiated responsibility. If my view is wrong, I would welcome Shoaib and Shravanti to talk about it. Okay, so I believe that Paris Agreement, as far as the developing world is concerned, was not a success because there was nothing legally binding on the developed world to ensure that they cut down their carbon emissions. Okay? Everything is voluntary, and there is nothing compelling anyone to do anything better. The second important point is about 10 years ago, they started a discussion on co-benefits. To me, co-benefit is completely confusing because initially started with the assumption that the major cause of air pollution in developing world is black carbon. And if the developing world controls black carbon emission, then it will reduce global warming. Now, 10 years later, we know that that was completely the wrong approach. Black carbon's contribution to global warming is minuscule, and the latest IPCC report reflects that very clearly. So what's going to happen is, if India decides to control air pollution, which we should, because we are one of the most polluted countries in the world, if we do that, the major reduction in the air will be the sulfate aerosol, which reflect sun's radiation. So if we control our air pollution in the short term, which I think we should, actually we will contribute to global warming. This issue is not debated anywhere. This issue is swept under the carpet. Okay, so this should be discussed both within India and abroad, because countries like India and China, which have a serious air pollution problem, will need to control air pollution for purely local benefits. But that benefit may not translate to global temperature change. Okay, this issue is not highlighted by anyone, and it is important to highlight that. Now, in this connection, there's another issue, which is methane. Now, due to political reason, methane and black carbon were put together as short-term climate forces. Okay, they should not have done it because methane has a lifetime of around 10 years. Black carbon has a lifetime of 1 week. So the two cannot be treated together, but they were treated together for a political reason. And now it's time to forget that. Now, in the case of methane, already there is a global alliance to control methane. And when it comes to methane, Indian policymakers get a little nervous because about 20, 30 years ago, India was accused of a major methane emitter through our cows. Okay, that was based on wrong data, but now we know that methane emission by Indian cows is nowhere near that of cows in Europe and America. So that is not the dominant issue. Of course, there is methane emission from rice cultivation, which has to be looked at. But what was completely ignored till recently was methane emission from oil and gas wells. These can be easily controlled if a proper legislation is made in the respective countries. And this is, I think, the immediate priority of those involved in controlling methane emission, because the advantage of methane emission is that in the short term, it will give you a very high benefit. In the next 10 years, if you control the methane emission from oil wells and gas producing regions, then you'll get some benefit which we can use to adjust our future reduction in CO2. Okay. Now, the other issue that we must remember that there was talk about air conditioning. It is true that as India becomes richer, more and more people demand air conditioning. To me, even without India becoming richer, there will be more demand for air conditioning because of global warming. And global warming also causes short-term heat waves, very large heat waves, like the extreme rainfall events. Its counterpart is extreme heat wave events, which are going to increase in the next 10 years. And when these happen, there will be demand for more air conditioning. And as a matter of fact, I see in the next 10 years, the possibility that the government will be asked to provide for poor people places to stay for a short time in which there is cooling provided. Now, this is similar to what is happening in Delhi and other places in North India in winter. When it gets very cold, poor people are provided shelters so that they can overcome short-term problem with cold waves. Similar thing has to be done with heat waves. So to me, the demand for air conditioning will go up, not only because we hope to get richer, but also because global warming will cause more heat waves. So that issue has to be addressed more clearly. The next issue I want to bring up is many of our goals are related to energy intensity per unit GDP. Okay, and that problem to me is that in case of a GDP falls, as it has in the last 1 year due to COVID, how will we take care of it? So, people who say our energy intensity per unit GDP will go down are assuming that our GDP will grow faster than our energy consumption. But if in the case economy has a problem like it has in the last 2 years, we have to worry about our goals for emission intensity of unit GDP. There's I would like Shravanti and Shoaib to look at. Okay. Now, the final issue I want to talk about is most of the climate-related policies are driven from the central government in India. Most incentives and most policies. State governments have played a very limited role, partly because they don't have the money. But on the other hand, every state government has produced climate change reports as to how climate change will affect their districts and taluks and so on. But the irony is that most of these are produced without understanding that the global climate models that are used to produce these climate change impact at the district level have no physical basis. This is because IPCC clearly indicated. Can you hear me? There's a problem with the internet.
Yeah, now we can hear it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, so the question is, the state governments do not seem to understand that climate models cannot be used at the district level. Climate models are not accurate enough at district level. Secondly, when it comes to district level, the major cause of climate change is not carbon dioxide emission. It is local land use change, aerosols, and other factors. And many models do not take into account these local factors. So I think this issue must be addressed by our both state and central governments before they start making out various impact statements about climate change. So I'll stop here now and first request Shoaib and Shravanti to make some comments before I open it to the audience. Okay, Shoaib.
Okay. So I agree with you that some of the past discussion on especially on methane emissions and black carbon have been a significant digression. In fact, if you look at it currently, the highest increase in methane emissions have come from fracking and similar new ways of extracting oil, primarily in the US. There has to be a concentrated focus on some of these sources of emissions. And so, of course, while I agree with that, I think that at least in my case, the talk on pollution in India was primarily from the impact of pollution on health, and whatever we can do to reduce some of these impacts is very important. And if the attempt to reduce pollution also benefits some of our climate change goals, then that's twice as good. And I think this is something that that has been driving at least some of the policy making in India. So in that sense, it is climate change that becomes a co-benefit of a goal that actually has immediate impact on people's lives and livelihoods. The second issue that I would look at is for state action plans. I think that the way we do climate policy in India is itself has to be significantly changed, but that also has to do with the way the Indian governance structure is currently. One could argue that as a large country with such diversity, India should be in some sense more federal. And once that transformation happens in the governance system of India, then we could definitely expect more climate policy, especially policies on adaptation and resilience at the district and state levels. So of course, but these should be based on some directions, and that is where, as you pointed out, some of the downscaling approaches to producing reports on how much climate change will affect small areas comes in. And there, of course, there is a large amount of uncertainty, and a lot of these studies and reports often turn out to be quite wrong. But unfortunately, there is a demand and a supply for such reports, and that is why it keeps happening. So this is something that at least those working on climate science and adaptation in India have to focus on, to what is the right way to come up with studies that produce meaningful direction and results for local level impact, so that they can direct policy making in the right way. Now, with regards to what you said about Paris Agreement, it's true that what happened in Paris Agreement is that in some sense, this link of common but differentiated responsibilities with progress in climate mitigation was broken. It's because everybody essentially agreed to undertake a voluntary commitment approach. And it is that which has translated to a global net zero goal now being understood as individual net zero goals for different countries. So I think that if properly addressed, we can actually bring back common but differentiated responsibilities by looking at how we address this global net zero target. Because if we accept that global net zero emissions by 2020 is indeed, or 2060 is indeed a target that we should aim for, then that in some sense translates to a carbon budget for the world. It translates to available cumulative emissions, so a stock that we can fill. And then how one goes about dividing that carbon budget among different countries is where one can bring back the notion of fairness and common but differentiated responsibilities in. So that is the reason why in this COP, and if it is not settled in this COP, in future COPs, it is important to see that a global net zero goal is not translated to individual net zero commitments by countries. And so I hope that that is where at least the focus of India and other developing countries will be, so that we can bring back common but differentiated responsibilities into international climate policy making. Jay?
Okay, thank you, Shoaib. Now, Shravanti, has anything to add?
Yes, sir. I would like to add a couple of points just to. Yeah. About the Paris Agreement, it is evident that our commitment or our idea of climate change or what we are committing to it doesn't stand by itself, but it is very closely related to our diplomatic relations, foreign policy, and how we want the world to see us. So that's where I think we were compelled or coerced to make a decision whether we technically required to or not. I think that's the route for, I think, the beginning of what Shoaib was saying, that's where the entire thing started. That's one point. And the second is about the state action plan on climate change. One has to take into account that each of the states have their own welfare requirements, development needs, and their own budgets, their own ecological and environmental issues. The climate change or climate action in India is pretty much centralized, and majority of climate actions that had been planned or implemented in the states are primarily the renewable energy, or whether it is installing wind, solar, generating, buying, purchasing. But other things like what you have said, land use, or what's happening with the forest or land use, how is it being used, what is the local temperatures increasing, what can it be done, what cannot, what is being done, that is not taken into account. And also there is the state action plan doesn't have much teeth. They're just asked to report, but it's again exposed. What is being done in different schemes are picked up and then seen whether they match the climate actions or not, and then being reported and send it out. So that's what is happening with state action plan. That's it, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll open up this discussion to audience. I want you to put your hands up. I'm seeing one hand up. That is Yogendra Sama. Can you unmute and ask a question?
Sure. Thank you, Professor J.S. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would like to congratulate both speakers, Dr. Shravanti and Dr. Chakravarti, have given a wonderful debate as we go towards COP26. It's almost like an update or a prelude to the meeting which will be held from next week. So congratulations to both of you for pitching the ideas from an economic viewpoint. It is really wonderful for me to think about. I had a few concerns about the way you took only Dr. Shravanti took the first 4 sectors going towards the knowledge economy. Am I right? That was your 4th sector, which yes. I believe in India as also rest of the world is concentrated in cities. For example, most of the economy, knowledge economy that we are deriving benefit comes out of the cities, which obviously not going to be satisfied with your 2030 target, which I think you projected it at 450 gigawatts. Is that right?
Yes.
At that time, in 2030, assuming the population of India is 1.5 billion, you're looking at per capita of 300 watts. Is that right? About 300. You just divide 450, divided by 1.5 billion, you end up getting about 300. But what I'm afraid is in Bangalore, for example, in fact, I have made some notes on the 11th of March this year, the peak power demand in Bangalore was 13,837 megawatts, which is, if you translate it to per capita, it comes out as 1.8 kilowatts, which is 3 to 4 times the projections you have made. Therefore, my question to both of you, in fact, most of these COP meetings seem to be only focused about urban life, and they pay very little attention to rural problems of both farming, mining, many of the things which Professor J.S. also talked about. So my questions or comments, both of you, how would you then be able to address the growing urban challenge of meeting the demand at typically 1 to 1.5 kilowatt per capita, whereas the rest of the country will hardly be given even less than 100 watt per capita. So there's going to be a big inequality in this particular aspect. So this is one of the concerns that I've shared with many of my friends, including the founder of DC Cube, Professor Jay Srinivasan, and I'm very happy that the center is one of the 11 centers of excellence which will help our country move forward and solve some of the most challenging problems, perhaps for the generations to come. So I hope you're able to clear with my concern.
Thank you again. Let's have the response from Shoaib and Shravanti.
Thank you.
So the 450 gigawatt goal is for renewable generating capacity. So we obviously have other generating capacity. See, currently India has, I think, generates and consumes approximately 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And so, of course, there is significant disparity in electricity consumption in the country itself. And we have only recently achieved, universal electrification. Even that is uh, still to be translated in terms of 24 hours electricity supply for people. So, well, you're right that we will definitely need more electricity in the future, but this goal is only for 2030, and so I'm quite sure that India will install and will have more electricity generation in the future to meet both direct needs as well as the fact that the entire economy is electrifying. For example, if you take into account that if our electric vehicle policy is going to be successful, then a significant part of the transportation fuels will now move to electricity as well. So this is only an interim goal for 2030. I'm sure India will need and will definitely have significantly higher electricity generating capacity in the future.
No, I think you actually you did not get my point. My point is most of these COPs seem to be addressing the needs of the urban economies or urban industries, but they're really serious about the kind of problems that the mining for the farming sectors are likely to face in the event of coming up with very big rhetoric about 2050, the carbon zero, and all these pacts and all that. Are they really looking at the rural problems of farming and mining and these problems as what keeps the manufacturing sector alive? That is the concern I raised. I hope.
Adaptation. See, the COP deals with adaptation and mitigation as well. We have focused primarily on India's mitigation policies because these are the ones that have been successful, and these are the ones that will very likely the Indian government will focus on in the near future. But when it comes to adaptation towards climate change, both from the point of view of agriculture as well as from the point of view of health and well-being, that is definitely something that is discussed at the COPs and is also discussed at the national level in India.
That's how it started actually following Rio in 1992, the first meeting of COP at Berlin in 1985 through Delhi and now Glasgow. That's how it started, but soon I think slowly we are forgetting how it started and we're only looking at this tax power concept of trying to make money. I don't think that is the way to go about it. We have to bring in technology to make sure there is no carbon. And methane has gone up, last 10 years like anything. And it's, as you know, methane molecule for every 415 molecules of CO2, we have two methane molecules right now. And each methane molecule is about 50 to 60 times more dangerous than each CO2 molecule. So I think what I'm trying to say is whether we are taking these COPs more seriously from a scientific basis, or it is turning out like World Economic Forum, which we have every other year, every year. Is it turning out like that? So this is my concern because one of the panel members is an economist. So I was just wondering whether you would think it is going on the same lines as the World Economic Forum.
Okay, I think we will open the thing to other audience. Dr. Paramesh?
Yes, thank you very much. I wish you both very good success in policy making.
Sir, I would sincerely thanks Shravanti and Dr. Shoaib Chakravarti for their lucid thoughts and your excellent comments. I appreciate. I'm a health-related issue. I think health and the survival of life is very catastrophic. We are all working for that purpose only. You mentioned once health-related issue, and thank you for that. I got 3 questions. Number 1, during the International Solar Alliance started in Paris Accord, only 2 countries were there. Now we have over 111 countries. And we're supposed to get the money what we are spending up till 2021. From next year, we should be able to get our grid, the electricity. Where are we standing in this situation, sir? We're supposed to get nearly 175,000 megawatts of electricity from 2022. Where do we stand it, sir?
So the goal was to have 175 gigawatts or 175,000 megawatts of new renewable energy by 2022. And we are currently at 100. So I believe we probably might not reach 175, but we will definitely go quite far. I think we are probably, given what is already in the pipeline, I believe 130 or 140 is very likely to be achieved by 2022.
Second thing is the China going to increase the atomic energy, clean energy, what we claim. We have not mentioned it, as a matter of fact. In a way, it's good knowing the background. They are going to enhance from 9% to 20% by 2030. So where do we stand in this situation? Are we looking to that one with the safety margin of utilizing the atomic energy?
Well, one reason we haven't mentioned nuclear is because if you look at India's current electricity generation, then nuclear provides approximately 3%. We have 6,000 megawatts of nuclear generating capacity. And it seems unlikely that it is going to expand very fast. I think in the best scenario, it will probably grow by a factor of 3 to be optimistic by 2020. So nuclear is likely to remain a small sector. But what is important to note is that it is very likely to stay. Now, given the uncertainty in how far storage and battery capacity can go, you see, I always say that it is the future of battery and storage technologies that decide the fate of a large number of other technologies, whether it's nuclear or coal or something else. Now, if cheap and plentiful storage capacity, technologies for cheap and plentiful storage capacities are available, then the need for nuclear will be significantly lower. But if it is not the case, then as a backup technology that is both green and not and stable, in the sense that it can provide backup power for and be a stable source of power on the grid, nuclear power will remain as a significant but minor source in India, at least for the time being.
Thank you, sir. The last question. Well, the black carbon, definitely depending on the number of carbon particle in the alveolar macrophage cells, it is directly proportional to the decrease in the lung capacity. Much more so in the silent zone, in the small airways, they deposit, produce a chronic inflammation. That we know, as a matter of fact, how to manage it, inflammation. But now I heard recently, the Himalayan Gangetic Valley, there is a brown carbon. We don't know anything about the brown carbon. What it is, its effect on the health, we don't know anything about it. If you know anything, can you highlight to us, sir, in few points? What is brown carbon?
I think Professor Srinivasan will be best to answer this question.
Yeah, the distinction black and brown carbon is based on the way it is measured. Brown carbon is, black carbon is pure soot. Okay. Brown carbon is combination of soot and organic carbon, which also comes out of incomplete combustion. And I don't think anybody has looked at the medical consequences of organic carbon. I think it's important for some of the doctors to start examining that, because the amount of organic carbon may be higher than black carbon in some regions. So this has not been measured sufficiently well. So I think this needs to be highlighted.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah. Now, Rohini had put up her hand, but I don't see her. Is Rohini there?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Sure.
My question and comment is on a slightly different tangent. What I wish to ask is, we always speak about GDP. So do we, at this point, need a better indicator than GDP for sustainable growth? Because continuous growth, continuous GDP is sort of incoherent with sustainable development. So when there is maybe increase in population, then it's like a negative effect of population growth, and it exceeds the positive effects. So do we need a better indicator than GDP as a indicator of an economic growth because maybe it perhaps doesn't align with other, maybe the dimensions of sustainability and ecological or biodiversity degradation. Because we for example, like we continuously use a lot of fertilizer, etc., to enhance agricultural productivity, and which might of course reflect as a higher GDP. But at this point, do we need another indicator as a measure of better economic growth? That's what I'd like to ask.
There's an indicator called green GDP. It's just not, doesn't account only for the economic development, but also it accounts for the forestry, the other ecological indicators. But that's something which we don't use often in this language when you're talking about climate change. I agree with you. GDP just in terms of the monetary benefits is not the sustainable, not the right indicator when we are talking in terms of climate change, sustainable development. But yes, till now, I don't think we do have a proper language that combines the economic development plus the climate change and the climate action and the challenges that involve. But green GDP is a concept that has been there for some time now.
I agree with you. GDP is a very flawed metric. Unfortunately, it has been in use for so long that primarily because it is there, that it continues to be used. Some of my past work has been on, taking Human Development Index as the metric instead. Because in some sense, as our goal as a society is not to have the highest possible GDP, it is to have the highest possible, as the best possible life. Now, often some other indicators are possibly a better measure of this. For example, I think Bhutan and I believe the previous French president also wanted to focus on gross national happiness. Then, as Shravanti mentioned, there is green GDP, which in some sense takes economic benefit, then ecological footprint, as well as social well-being into account. But as is the case, any of these is also more complicated and more complex to both define, measure, and then put out. In fact, GDP itself, though we think of it as some sort of a fixed number, itself is the product of a large amount of econometric and statistical processing. And so it's going to be a bit more, difficult, especially if you want to also make it a quantitative notion. For example, yesterday's talk, which I really liked, Donut Economics, at the end of the day, what I realized is that, while it makes complete sense and we understand it intuitively, it is in some sense difficult to make it quantitative. And that is where often a problem arises. As when we want to do policy, when we want to, even as a government, the government wants to deal with numbers. We as policymakers and modelers also want to deal with something that is quantifiable so that we can model and project it into the future. And then while we all want to develop better metrics and indicators, often we fall back on GDP simply because it is already there and a lot of investment has gone into it. And while
it's also a common metric at the global level. So.
It is also a common metric, that is true. Yeah.
Correct. So so do you think then the economists should now work towards developing better indicators, at least for to start with, because definitely the land use, there is a change in land use policy, land use management, which varies across countries. So in that sense, do we need a better indicator, and can we develop better indicators which can help us? And perhaps these could then be, accepted worldwide, globally.
I think more than better indicators, we need more indicators. We should not privilege GDP. That is the most important thing. We must, depending on the context, there should be more than one indicator, and that is what we have been using. For example, if you recollect, Human Development Index was only invented 30 years ago. and now it plays such a big role.
Yeah.
And then Human Development Index itself has now been further fiddled with, so that now we have a Human Development Index that looks at gender, another one that looks also takes inequality into account. So what is important is to not privilege any one particular number, but to have various kinds of such indices and then use these wherever it is appropriate. I think that is possibly the better way forward.
Just to add, we don't have right data as well to create these indicators or measure them and put it out there. Data is one thing. When we are talking about climate change or climate action, we don't have right data to take an account as in how and what is happening over years. Suppose you talk about energy, we don't have energy consumption data at a say agriculture level. We don't have at a farmers unit level, at a household farming household level. We don't have an idea of what kind of energy is going into the agriculture practices, or at which level, and what kind of appliances that are being used. So to have useful indicators, we have to have reliable data. That is also one thing which we are missing on.
Okay, thank you. Now, Nafka. Nafka, are you there? Please unmute.
Why can't we see the other?
Yeah.
Should this way.
Okay, I don't see Nafka responding. So now let's, Anupama there?
Yes, sir, can you hear me?
Okay, okay.
So thank you. Thank you both of you for your talk. It was very interesting. Unfortunately, I missed a few minutes at the end because I got an urgent phone call. So I'm not sure if you mentioned this in your talk, but I wanted to ask, there's been a lot of news recently about, a coal shortage in India and, the power crisis. And I just sort of wanted to ask you about whether that has any sort of implications in terms of climate action from the power sector in India.
So the coal shortage, I believe, is a combination of some sort of, you could say it's one is a management and logistical failure of sorts. That's number one, and number two, maybe there is indeed we're probably not mining sufficient coal for our current demand. So let me say that even though we feel that there is a coal shortage now, India was actually generating more electricity from coal only 3 months ago in the summer. So what happens is that in India, in the drier months, preferably in spring, the coal mines actually mine significant amount of coal, and then these are then the stock of coal is both kept at the mine as well as at the power plants. And then this is used when it is more difficult to mine coal. For example, in the rainy season, mining goes down, mines are flooded, transportation is difficult, so it goes down. Now, so every power plant actually has to keep a stock of coal, and this is what you would call the inventory, and typically they're supposed to keep a month's worth of coal in inventory at the power plant level. What happened in India, I think this year, I believe, is a combination of various things. Number one, I think that the second wave might actually have affected mining in April, May, June months. So maybe mining had actually gone down slightly. Number two, given that we are actually in some sense, a 2-year-long recession of sorts. So not only did power demand go down, but payment for power itself also went down. So a large number of generators actually have not got enough money from selling power or from their customers. Customers haven't paid enough. So they themselves are not unable to buy buy coal to run their power plants. So that is something that very likely prevented a large number of generators or coal power plants from buying coal. And I'm not sure some of it could be psychological, given that people were constantly expecting a third wave in September and October. So it is very likely that this might have affected the purchase of coal. So if the expectation of the power plant managers was that that power demand wouldn't grow so much, and there is likely to be a third wave, then they might not have bought enough coal also. And this is what happened. So around this time last year, on an average, Indian power plants had approximately 18 to 20 days of coal at stock. This is what I checked from data itself just a couple of days ago. Whereas in April of this year, it had about 10-12 days. By August, it had come down to 8, and by September and now it is down to approximately 4 days of stock. So it is in some sense very much a logistical problem. Besides the fact that you could definitely say that it is likely that we are not mining and transporting sufficient amount of coal as required by the power plants. At the same time, the international market of coal in some sense exploded. Right now, price of coal on the international market is almost $200 a ton. That is something like 5-6 times what it was last year. So, power plants in South India and Gujarat, which depend on imported coal, just could not afford to buy the coal, because if they bought the coal, they wouldn't be able to sell the power. So the demand for domestic coal increased even more. So I think it's this kind of a short-term mismatch, but I believe this is a problem that could have been planned for. But even if it hasn't been planned for, it is not likely to be a permanent problem. It can be solved quite easily, and it will be solved in the next few weeks.
All right, thank you. But then would you say that something like this might incentivize people to, look for alternatives in terms of energy sources?
Exactly. See, this problem is not specific to India. We find world over that there has been a demand for fossil fuels, whether it is coal in India or China, and then gas in Europe. Demand for fossil fuels have now suddenly outstrips supply, because these are commodities where you cannot turn on a tap and suddenly have more coal or gas or oil. It takes time. And so what most people, including, if you ask me, believe that this particular shortage is actually, in some sense, is not something that is, speaks ill of renewables. It actually shows that depending more on fossil fuels itself has its own risks, and we are going to very likely invest more in renewable energy, not only in India but in the rest of the world, and expand it, because it's from the energy security point of view, it is better to have more renewable energy. In fact, you could have said that our problems would have been lower if we actually had more renewable energy. We couldn't deploy as much solar and wind in the last 1.5 years because of the pandemic. But if we had more, then the effect of this coal shortage would have been lower.
Right, thank you.
Okay, is Nafka still there? Hand is up. I don't see any unmuting of the mic. So if it's not there, then I would like to thank Shoaib and Shravanti for a very nice presentation, and we had a very good discussion. And Shoaib, I presume we can invite all the audience to attend the GOWC symposium. They're all welcome, right?
They are all welcome. Let me, I believe you have all received an email, but not yet. Let me share my screen again, which will, wait. Is that? Yeah, so can you?
Yeah, it's visible, yes.
You can see the panel discussion. This is the announcement. I believe you've got a mail from the campus, from the bulletin, what's it called?
Yes. Campus bulletin, yeah.
Yeah, the campus bulletin.
Yeah, so all of you are welcome to attend this, which will further, there'll be more experts along with Shoaib to talk about this issue. So, thank you all for participating. And I think we should have more of this discussion in DCC in the future. Okay,
yes,
thank you.
I definitely want to say that this is in some sense the first of the series of climate change discussions, and I'm sure we will have these at least once a month going forward, especially on policy and adaptation.
Okay, thank you. So see you all on 26th. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.